I saw a few movies this week. Let's talk about them. The first thing I saw was The Card Counter. This film is written and directed by Paul Schrader, and if you don't know that name, you probably know his work. He's had quite a long career as a screenwriter and wrote the films Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, but he's also directed quite a few films as well. His 2017 movie, First Reformed, was quite a critical darling. I thought it was a really good film, but I certainly didn't go as rabid for it as others did. His new film, The Card Counter, stars Oscar Isaac as a former US soldier who was stationed at Abu Ghraib. After an 8-year prison sentence, he now spends his days going from casino to casino, playing poker and blackjack. He meets a young man named Kirk, played by Ty Sheridan, whose father was also at Abu Ghraib and also tortured prisoners. Kirk believes that the men in charge got off too easy, while the soldiers doing the grunt work were the ones who served time. So he approaches Oscar Isaac's character William with a plan to get revenge. This movie is a pretty shining example of something that is just not for me. A whole lot of this movie is just characters playing poker and talking about poker in excruciating detail, which I guess to some people might be pretty interesting, but for me, there are very few things that I'm less interested in than poker and casinos and gambling. One line that really stood out to me in the film was about how poker is about waiting for something to happen and then finally something happens, and I'm pretty certain that that was a meta-commentary on the film itself. The vast majority of this movie is just waiting for something to happen, and at the end, something does, but everything before that is just so boring and repetitive. And I can certainly handle repetitive, but not when the main character is this uninteresting. The movie presents William as a mysterious man with a mysterious past who keeps his cards close to his chest, pun intended, but he's only a mystery to other characters rather than the audience because we've already seen his past, and that makes for a very unengaging experience, especially when none of the other characters are interesting either. Tiffany Haddish is in the film, strangely, and her character really does not add much except a couple of needed moments of levity, but apart from that, she's really only there to be a cliched love interest. Ty Sheridan's character is the most interesting simply because he's the only one with any real sort of motivation, but his motivation is literally avenging his father's death, which frankly I have seen in too many movies to still find it interesting without any sort of secondary motivation or reasons to care about this character. The performances are quite good though. Oscar Isaac gives a great performance and looks fine as hell doing it. The character requires an incredibly subdued performance, and he does a great job with it. It makes his few moments of intensity really intimidating. I also really liked Tiffany Haddish in it. She's very believable as a real person, she's charismatic and funny, and yeah, not a whole lot to say about her because her character doesn't do much, but the performance is good. Willem Dafoe, my favorite actor, has a really small role in it and doesn't show up very often, but when he does, Willem, as always, gives it his all. I think Ty Sheridan is the weakest performance. He's not bad, I just don't know if he was very well cast in this role. His believability kind of waxes and wanes throughout the film. It's also shot pretty efficiently and effectively. There's one sequence in particular that takes place in a botanical garden that's all lit up that I thought was unbelievably gorgeous. There are also several sequences that are kind of dreams/memories, and they're presented in a very interesting way visually. They're shot with a fisheye lens that distorts the image. It's often done in one take, and there's this kind of hideous yellow light that's intentionally hideous. These scenes were quite impressive and visually interesting, and probably my favorite parts of the film. The music was effectively moody, and it's not the most memorable thing in the world, but it really serviced the film. My biggest complaints with this film are just from narrative and character levels. I don't really have any issues with how it's presented, but even in the narrative there are things I appreciated. Like I said, you spend the whole movie waiting for something to happen, and when the something does happen, it's really engaging. There's a clever setup that pays off well in this final act, and the way it's reincorporated really made my heart fall into my stomach. I really liked how this film concludes on a narrative level, but on a deeper character level, it doesn't really say all that much. I didn't feel that any of the characters underwent any sort of arc. They start and end the film with the same motivations. It also doesn't really have much to say politically, which I have to assume was the intention, given that this is centered around Abu Ghraib and torturing terrorist suspects. But I don't think the film really says anything more than torture is bad and people who torture should be held accountable, which, we've been new. I definitely don't hate this movie. There was a lot to appreciate about it, but I found it incredibly boring and I will never watch it again. There is definitely an audience for this, which is probably straight men who like poker, and that counts me out. But if you do fall into that category, then you should go see The Card Counter and you'll probably have a good time. For me, it is a 3-star film. There's also a new Halloween movie in theaters, and despite the fact that it has possibly the worst title of any movie ever, I was really looking forward to it. If you weren't aware, this is the second in a new trilogy that ignores all of the previous Halloween films except the original from 1978. So the 2018 film Halloween was actually not a remake, but a sequel to the original Halloween, and this movie, Halloween Kills, is a sequel to the 2018 film Halloween, but it is not a sequel to the 2007 film Halloween. Got it? For context, I have seen every Halloween film except for the 2 Rob Zombie films, which I'm going to get around to in the next few days, and while the original is not only one of my favorite horror films, but one of my favorite films of all time, I think the series as a whole is probably my least favorite of the long-running slasher franchises like this, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street. The drop in quality between the first and second films is honestly pretty impressively huge. But with that said, I actually had quite fond memories of the 2018 film, even though I hadn't seen it since it was in theaters, and decided to revisit it before seeing Halloween Kills. And to be honest, I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would on a rewatch. It's by no means a great film. The opening sequence is pretty goofy, and there are some really weird narrative decisions made in the third act. But the film is anchored by how well it explores Laurie Strode's trauma and how it impacted how she raised her child, and many of the horror set pieces were presented in a genuinely creative and frightening way. So all of that gave me quite a bit of optimism going into Halloween Kills, and I honestly haven't been this torn on a movie in a very long time. It has many of the same issues as the 2018 film, but it also has many of the opposite issues, where its predecessor made its worst decisions in the third act and kind of left me baffled as to why some things happened. This film's second half is leagues better than its first. The story goes in really interesting directions that I've never seen from a Halloween film, and it deals with genuinely complex emotions in a way that I thought was really effective. There were several deaths in the film that I really felt, and that's incredibly rare from a slasher. So while I felt the story of the first one was a bit strangely conceived, but its execution was great, with this one I really love the narrative, but don't think it has nearly the same amount of style. The murder scenes in the first one were handled with, dare I say, subtlety. There's one great moment where you can just see something happening in the background, and it is very small and out of the way and easy to miss. There's also an impressive one-take sequence that I can picture just from memory, but there's not one single scene like that in Halloween Kills, which is very strange given that it's helmed by the same crew. The death scenes are gory, but not as brutal, and the way in which they're shot is completely indistinguishable from pretty much any other slasher. That is until the ending, in which some stuff is presented pretty interestingly, but still not as effective as the original. One thing that is consistent between the two is the attempts at comedy. They are spectacularly unfunny and completely drag the film to a halt. I gotta rant about this really quick, so bear with me. Sitting in front of me was a couple with their young son, as in way too young to be at this type of movie, and the man seemed to think that every lazy joke in this movie was like the pinnacle of comedy, but didn't realize it until 5 seconds after everyone else had stopped laughing. So a character would say a joke, you'd hear some scattered chuckling throughout the audience, and then a couple seconds of silence, and then this man would laugh louder than anything you have ever heard before. To make things even worse, he would then turn to his wife or girlfriend and loudly repeat the line because he thought it was so funny. The audience was so disrespectful and loud that I considered leaving the theater and going to another screening, but then I remembered that this is a horror movie and it's October and every screening was probably going to be equally obnoxious. If you want to be loud and not pay attention to a movie or just talk over it, then please do it in the comfort of your own damn living room and stop ruining the experience of watching movies for other people. Ugh! Anyway, the attempts at comedy I thought were pretty embarrassing. I never laughed. It drags the movie down. It completely stops in its tracks just to try to be funny and fails. Danny McBride is credited as one of the writers, just like he was for the last movie, and I honestly would not be surprised if they just brought him in to write every joke because it feels like different writers and it's so awkward and out of place, and in a perfect world he would not be a writer on the final film in this trilogy. Jamie Lee Curtis returns once again, but much like Halloween 2, she spends most of the movie in the hospital, and it's actually more of Judy Greer's film. She plays Laurie's daughter, Karen, and I thought she was great, and I really liked her character and what they did with her. Judy Greer is an actor I've liked for a really long time. If you don't know, she voices Carol/Cheryl in Archer and is really funny, and I've liked her in everything I've seen her in, so it's nice to see her getting a really big role in a big movie like this. The rest of the cast was mostly fine. There are some pretty bad child performances, and even though Jamie Lee Curtis doesn't have as big a role as I would have liked in this movie, she still gives it her all and is really believable as a traumatized woman who only has one goal in life, and there's a genuinely great exploration of generational trauma that's carried over from the last film, personified by Laurie and her daughter and granddaughter. How each of them processes this horrible event that happened 40 years ago is really interesting and unique to each of their characters. It's this dynamic that makes the characters in this film a lot more likable and watchable than most characters in horror movies. One last aspect of the movie I want to mention is the score. The Halloween theme by John Carpenter is one of the most effective and memorable pieces of music from any movie in history, and I'm happy to say that it's done great justice here. It's used very appropriately, it's not overused, and the way in which it is transformed is really musically impressive. Every time I watch a Halloween movie, this theme playing over the opening credits just gets me so jazzed for what I'm about to watch, even if it's not going to be very good. I think I've said all I have to say about this movie. I know my thoughts seem kind of scattered, but the movie itself is pretty scattered as well, so I guess it's a meta commentary, if you will. I realize it might be kind of hard to gauge whether I liked this movie overall because there were elements I loved and there were elements I hated. So overall I'm gonna say that I did like it. There seems to be some pretty negative backlash against this film, and I think I'm gonna end up on the side of people who defend it. Not necessarily because it's a great movie or because it's well executed, because I honestly am not sure it is. But a lot of people seem to have issues with this movie on a very fundamental level, as in what happens in the narrative, and that is not where my issues lie. It's a movie with great ideas that do kind of get bogged down in the execution, and I'm not sure where it went wrong. Maybe there's too many writers, maybe the director didn't do a great job, but I got enough out of it to justify seeing it, and I'll probably buy it on Blu-ray and see it again, so sue me. Initially I gave this 3 stars, but I think I'm gonna bump it up to 3.5, because it really did leave an impression on me and won me over by the end. And finally, I want to talk about The Medium. This is a mockumentary-style horror film from Thailand that was just released on Shudder. And to be honest, I don't usually check out these Shudder originals unless they really catch my eye. The only one that I've seen that I would say is actually a great film is the documentary Horror Noir, which I recommend to everybody, but I was really interested in The Medium from the time I found out about it because one of the writers of this film also wrote The Wailing, which I have no qualms calling a modern horror masterpiece. This film is presented as a documentary about a shaman in the Isan region of Thailand, whose family has historically served as a vessel for a benevolent goddess, and her niece is beginning to show signs of possession from that same goddess, but things predictably go south. The mockumentary-style horror film is something that I consider near impossible to get right. There is always a turning point in the narrative when things get scarier and more dangerous for the crew supposedly filming, and I always end up saying to myself, there is no way that they would continue filming, and even if they did, there is no way that this would be shown to the public because it's practically a snuff film. And The Medium is sadly not immune to that fundamental hurdle, but it's very impressive how far it's able to get with the documentary being entirely believable. It smartly chooses for the bulk of the film not to characterize the documentary crew at all. They occasionally talk to the subjects they're interviewing, but there's certainly no attempt to actually make them characters in the film. And the performances from the subjects of the supposed documentary are pretty fantastic. The central performance from Sawani Utuma is emotional and very believable. The core of this film is the relationship between her character character Nim and her family. The first half does a great job of exploring how her identity as a shaman has impacted her relationship with her Christian sister. All of the family members are properly developed and given their own personality traits, and they all feel like very real people. And that proves to be not only satisfying, but necessary when the narrative kind of shifts between which character it is actually centered around. And it fits so well with the documentary style. When you set out to make a documentary, you don't know everything that's going to happen, and sometimes the focus shifts about halfway through, and that kind of happens in this movie numerous times. It just adds legitimacy to the style and makes it more immersive. My biggest problem with this film, though, is that it sets up something that's a lot more challenging than what it actually ends up being. The first half is a subtle, slow burn where the horror comes from watching a loved one change into something that you no longer recognize. But by the end, it just becomes a found footage scarefest that is really well executed, but it really doesn't make the most out of the emotional setups that the film did so well in the first half. The best comparison I can make is it's like if you had the first hour and a half of The Exorcist and then just bolted on the last half hour of Wreck. They're both great movies, but they have completely different goals. The Exorcist aims to make you think and feel, and Wreck aims to thrill and scare you. And there are certainly films that pull off both of these quite well, but in the medium it feels very disjointed. The first half and the second half do not feel like the same movie, and I was definitely more into the first half. But with that said, the horror in the final act is not remotely sanitized. There are things that happen that are just conceptually horrific and stomach-turning. And while it's undoubtedly too much for some people, if you are looking to be scared by a horror film, this will probably do the trick. Another issue is that once it gets more into the traditional found footage stuff, that's where the documentary style starts to break down quite a bit and just turn into found footage. There are night vision sequences with actual jump scare cues in the music, which do not feel like something a real documentary would do. For the first time in the film, you start to remember that there's somebody behind the camera because they're running away from the horrors on screen, and it really goes full on with the blood and guts. Again, it's not bad, it just doesn't feel as carefully constructed as the first half. The effectively tense scenes in the first half often have characters reacting to something before we even see it, and that's a great way to ratchet up the tension in the final moments before showing us something shocking. What really sells the horror in the final act is the performance from the possessed niece. It's an incredibly physical performance in which she becomes emaciated and has to walk around all creepy on her hands and knees. There's not really anything from the possession angle that we've never seen before, but her incredibly committed performance makes it effective. So I do have my issues with this movie structurally, but overall, I thought it was great. At over 2 hours, it is a bit of a commitment, but if you're looking for something to watch this Halloween season that will probably actually scare you and also delivers on the emotion, then I'd say definitely check it out. And certainly check out this writer's previous film, The Wailing. I'm certainly really glad I watched the medium, and I'm gonna give it 4 stars out of 5. And that's it for this review. If you've seen any of these movies and want me to know your thoughts, then please get in touch. I'd love to hear what you think, and I'll see you next time.